The desert evening was sinking into silence when old rancher Thomas Hawley noticed something strange. By the edge of his fence line, a dark shape half buried in dust, too still to be a coyote and too small to be a grown man. Curiosity and an unease he couldn't name pulled him from his porch, boots crunching against the dry earth as he stepped closer. And what he found made his weathered heart tighten. Lying there was a native girl, no older than 16, her skin pale beneath layers of dirt, lips cracked from thirst, and her breathing so faint it seemed like the wind might snuff it out altogether. And for a long moment Thomas just stood frozen, torn between caution and compassion, because he knew the dangers of helping one of her people. Yet something in her fragile stillness refused to let him turn away. Kneeling beside her, he carefully lifted her head, whispering words she likely couldn't understand, and carried her back toward his cabin, his arms trembling not from her weight, but from the storm of consequences he could already imagine, because the Apaches did not forgive trespasses, and a white rancher sheltering one of their own would never be taken lightly. Inside the cabin, he laid her on a worn blanket near the fire, poured a trickle of water between her lips, and watched with relief as her throat moved to swallow, then worked quickly to clean her wounds, with rough hands that had stitched cattle more often than people, muttering that she'd best hang on if she had the will to live. Outside, the desert stretched endless and empty, but Thomas felt the weight of unseen eyes already on him, as though the land itself carried whispers of what he had done. And as the girl stirred weakly in her fevered sleep, a faint word escaped her cracked lips, a name, broken and fragile though he couldn't make sense of it. It struck him deep, like a promise he hadn't meant to make. That night, Thomas sat awake by the fire, rifle across his lap, staring at the door while the girl's shallow breathing filled the cabin, knowing that whatever road had brought her to his fence, it was a road that would soon bring others. And by morning, the desert would not be empty anymore, but filled with riders who would come looking for blood and answers. Dawn came slow, spilling pale light across the desert like a warning, and Thomas Hawley stepped onto his porch with weary eyes after a night of restless watching, the rifle still close at hand, every creak of wood and whisper of wind putting his nerves on edge, for he had spent the hours listening to the faint breath of the girl inside, and to the louder silence of the world outside. Sure enough, as the sun began to rise, a low rumble carried through the dry air. Not thunder but hooves, many hooves, the kind of sound that rattled through the chest before the ears caught up. But as the horizon swam into focus, he saw lines upon lines of mounted warriors cresting the red ridges, spears glinting in the dawn, their numbers swelling until the desert floor seemed to shift beneath them like a living tide. And he counted hundreds, far more than he had ever imagined. He stood rooted to the porch, the old boards creaking under his boots, while the riders fanned out in a great arc, their formation tightening until his ranch lay in the center of a ring of fire and dust, 300 Apache horsemen circling his fence with silent precision, the thunder of hooves pounding into the earth like war drums. And for a breathless moment Thomas thought of running, though he had nowhere to go, then of fighting, though his rifle was nothing against such a sea. And at last he thought of the girl inside, realizing with a shudder that she was the reason they had come, that the fragile life he had carried from the dust had called an army to his door. The lead warrior, tall and broad-shouldered, rode forward from the circle, feathers streaming in the wind, his face painted in dark lines that caught the rising sun, and he raised his hand in a signal that froze the entire host into silence. Itself had bowed to his command. Thomas tightened his grip on the porch rail, sweat running cold down his spine despite the heat, and in that stillness he felt the weight of every eye upon him, measuring him, judging him, and waiting for his next move. And as the girl inside stirred faintly in her fevered sleep, the rancher knew his decision. Last night had set the stage for a reckoning he could neither flee nor ignore, a reckoning that would determine whether his ranch became his grave or the place where two worlds clashed and something new was born. The circle of warriors pressed close around the ranch, their silence more chilling than a war cry, and Thomas Hawley felt the air thicken with danger as the leader dismounted, boots hitting the ground with a solid thud that echoed like judgment. The man's eyes were sharp as flint, scanning the small cabin, the corral, and finally fixing on Thomas with a weight that pierced deeper than any blade. And though Thomas had stood against storms, rustlers, and hunger, this gaze made him feel like a trespasser in his own land. The leader spoke in a tongue Thomas barely understood, but the tone was unmistakable demand, accusation, perhaps even warning, and when no answer came, another warrior rode forward holding up a spear, the tip pointing toward the cabin door, making clear that they sought the one inside. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest as he glanced back through the open door, catching sight of the girl stirring weakly on the blanket. And in that instant, Thomas understood the impossible choice before him. Give her back and risk their wrath for the delay, or shield her and invite death at the hands of 300. His rough hands clenched around the rifle, yet he didn't lift it, for he knew the instant he raised, the barrel would be the instant the sky filled with arrows. And so instead he stepped off the porch slowly, his boots crunching in the dust, and raised one open palm to show he meant no harm, the other hand resting on his chest as if to say the girl was under his care. Murmurs rippled through the warriors, some glaring, some surprised, and the leader's eyes narrowed as though trying to measure the truth of what this rancher claimed. The desert held its breath, the horses stamping restlessly, while Thomas stood alone in the circle of death, refusing to surrender the fragile life inside, but also refusing to brandish steel against them. And in that fragile pause he prayed silently that the Apaches would see not an enemy, but a man who had chosen mercy in a land that rarely allowed it. For a long, heavy moment no one moved, and the silence of 300 warriors pressed on Thomas Halley like the weight of a mountain, the only sounds the restless snorts of horses and the dry wind whispering over the desert plain. Then the Apache leader stepped closer, his expression unreadable, and with a sharp motion of his hand to warriors dismounted, advancing toward the cabin as if to claim the girl. But Thomas shifted, planting himself between them and the doorway, his rifle lowered but his body firm. And though he did not speak their tongue, the meaning was clear: she was under his protection. The warriors halted, eyes flashing with anger, and in that instant Thomas caught a flicker of something in the chief's gaze, not softness exactly. Behind him, the girl let out a faint cry, her voice raw and broken, and the sound seemed to ripple through the warriors like lightning, their faces tightening, some leaning forward in their saddles as if her weakness was proof of mistreatment. And Thomas's jaw clenched because he knew how it must look to the man-old rancher with a dying Apache child in his home. He raised his hands higher, voice rough with urgency as he spoke in English, slow and deliberate. Found her, dying, dust. I gave water, nothing more. And though they might not understand the words, he pointed to the canteen, then to her wounds, then back to himself, trying to carve the truth in the air. The leader studied him, silent as stone, and for a terrible heartbeat, Thomas thought he would give the signal for blood. But instead the man strode past him, ducking beneath the low doorway to kneel beside the girl, his broad hand brushing her forehead with a gentleness that did not match the hard paint on his face. And the girl's lips moved again, a whisper of a name that reached only him. Yet whatever she said made the leader's eyes blaze with shock and something deeper recognition. The warriors shifted restlessly, waiting for the command, while Thomas stood in the doorway with his heart hammering, knowing that what came next would decide not only his fate, but whether mercy would mean survival or war. The chief's presence filled the small cabin, his shadow stretching across the firelit walls as he turned slowly from the girl to the rancher, and in his dark eyes burned a storm of questions that words could not bridge. Thomas stood stiff, his palms open, rifle leaning against the doorframe, praying that the truth of his actions could be seen without language. But the weight of 300 warriors outside pressed against the thin wooden walls like a coming flood, and he knew one wrong move would drown him in blood. And the chief leaned down, straining to hear, his face hardening with recognition as if she had spoken a name that mattered, a name tied to his own bloodline. With a low growl he rose and barked something in Apache, and at once the circle outside erupted into shouts, horses rearing, spears clattering, a storm of anger that made Thomas's heart lurch. For though he did not know the words, the tone spoke of vengeance long held at bay. He stepped forward, desperate, pointing to her wounds, to the water, to the blood-stained cloths by her side, his voice hoarse as he repeated, I helped her, I helped. as if volume could cut through the wall of language between them. And for a moment the chief's eyes flickered, not with trust but with hesitation, the smallest crack in a wall of rage. Outside, the warriors tightened their circle, waiting for the order, but the leader's hand remained raised, holding them still. His gaze locked on Thomas as though weighing his soul. The rancher felt sweat drip down his temple, felt the barrel of his rifle cold against his arm though he dared not lift it. And in the stillness he realized what the girl had whispered was the only thread keeping him alive. Whatever she meant to him, whatever she was, it had bought Thomas seconds where there should have been none. The chief gave a low command, and the shouting ceased, the circle falling into tense silence again. For mercy or for doom. The desert morning grew hotter, the air thick with dust and judgment. The Apache chief's command had tied the rancher's fate to the wounded girl, and though Thomas did not know her name, he felt the weight of her blood, pulling him deeper into a conflict older than his years on the frontier. Inside the cabin, the girl trembled in her fever, whispering broken words, and every time her lips moved the chief leaned closer, his face carved with stone-hard lines, until at last he stepped back, his chest rising with a breath that sounded more like a growl, and he spoke a string of sharp commands to his men outside. Their spears angled toward the porch, while others raised bows, arrows glinting like shards of fire in the sun end. Thomas's hand twitched toward his rifle, but he forced himself still, knowing that to lift it meant the end. The chief turned to him, pointing first at the girl, then at Thomas, then to the open desert beyond the ranch, his meaning clear. He wanted the rancher to bring her forth, to surrender her into their hands. Thomas's stomach knotted, his mind racing through the consequences. If he stepped aside, she might live under their care, or she might vanish into a vengeance. He could not stop, but if he refused, he would not live long enough to find out. His boots felt nailed to the floor, his throat dry as sand. Yet in his chest something stirred, the stubborn streak that had carried him through years of drought, storms, and loneliness on this unforgiving land. He shook his head slowly, pressing a hand over his heart, then pointing at the girl, then lifting his palm as if to say, "Not yet. She is still too weak. Let her live first." Murmurs rippled through the warriors outside, low and angry, but the chief did not strike. Instead he narrowed his eyes, his silence more dangerous than shouting. The desert held its breath again. The standoff stretched to breaking, and Thomas knew he had only delayed the storm, not escaped it. The tension coiled tighter with every passing heartbeat, the desert sun climbing higher until the air shimmered like fire. Yet no man moved, not Thomas on his porch, not the Apache chief standing near the cabin door, not the 300 warriors encircling the ranch, with drawn bows and steady spears. It was the girl inside who finally broke the stillness, her weak cry carrying through the open doorway, like a thread binding them all together. And the chief turned sharply, striding back into the cabin where Thomas followed on instinct, his heart pounding as if he were stepping into a trial he could not win. The girl's eyes fluttered open, dark and clouded with fever, yet when they found the painted warrior looming above her, a spark of recognition flickered in them, and she whispered a single word, her voice cracked but full of meaning. Thomas could not understand it, but the chief froze, every line of his body rigid as though struck by a bullet, and then his features twisted with something fierce and raw grief, maybe, or rage held barely in check. No nameless wanderer abandoned to die in the dust. This girl belonged to him, whether as daughter, kin, or bloodline Thomas could not yet know. But the bond was there, undeniable. Outside, the warriors let out a low, rolling chant, their voices carrying like thunder as if the words she spoke had reached them too. And Thomas felt the earth itself tremble with the weight of what it meant. And though no words bridged their worlds, Thomas did the only thing he could. He spread his hands wide, pointing to the water jug, the bandages, the fire where he had kept her warm, then pressed his hand flat against his chest, declaring with his body what his tongue could not, that he had not harmed her, that he had given what little mercy a rancher could. The chief's nostrils flared, his jaw tight as stone, and for a long moment it seemed he might give the order to end it all, to wash the desert in blood. Yet instead he turned back to the girl, listening again as she whispered something only he could hear. Whatever it was, it stayed his hand. though it did not cool the fury in his eyes, and Thomas knew the standoff had shifted, but not ended. He was no longer facing 300 nameless warriors. He was standing inside a storm bound to family, vengeance, and honor, and the truth of who she was would decide if he lived through the day. The chief stood over the frail girl like a man torn between worlds, his chest rising with heavy breaths as though each one carried the weight of a decision too great to speak aloud. And Thomas Hawley felt the silence stretching thin, sharp as a blade ready to break. Outside, the 300 warriors waited without a sound, their patience a weapon in itself, for they would not move until their leader commanded it. And in that stillness Thomas sensed how near the end could be, how fragile the threat of his mercy was. The girl whispered again, her lips cracked but determined, her dark eyes never leaving the man who towered above her. And though Thomas could not understand the words, he saw them strike deep, for the chief flinched as if the desert wind had cut him to the bone. Slowly, he crouched at her side, his painted hand brushing damp strands of hair from her brow. And for the first time, Thomas glimpsed something human beneath. The mask of war sorrow, raw and heavy, the kind that only blood could carry. The rancher stepped closer, pointing once more to the water jug, the bandages, the firelight, repeating his silent plea for trust. And though the chief's eyes burned with suspicion, he gave no order for blood. At once the circle of warriors erupted into sound cries, chants, the pounding of spear shafts on the earth, but with a single barked command. They fell silent again, every eye fixed on their leader. Thomas followed to the doorway, sweat stinging his brow, and in that moment the chief turned his head, speaking low in English rough and heavy with accent, words that froze the rancher where he stood. "She is mine. Blood of my blood." The declaration hung in the air like thunder, and Thomas's heart lurched as the truth struck. This dying girl was the chief's own kin, perhaps daughter or niece, someone precious enough to bring 300 warriors to his fence. The chief's dark gaze cut into him, filled with fury and warning, yet beneath it lay a grim acknowledgement. This rancher had held her life in his hands when the desert would have claimed her. The meaning was clear. Thomas had stepped into something far larger than himself, and whether it made him ally or enemy would be decided in the hours to come.